Hey, you ever went through a hard season and had lots of grief around that season and thought there's no possible way there's any good in this? Hey, in this video, I dive into a conversation with my friend Sheena deeply into the process of grief and into even the redemptiveness of grief and what's really there. And I've been friends with Sheena for a couple years now. We've been kind of on a seminary journey together. And we've had plenty of conversations around this subject. And I thought it'd be great if we had this conversation almost in a public way to invite you guys into the conversation. So you guys can maybe take away some nuggets and take away some things that could help you on your journey of grieving and whatever that process looks like for you. So, Sheena, let's just start with go ahead for me and just define grief for me from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think I went to just looking at Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's kind of definition, who she was, a psychiatrist who kind of pioneered the study of death and dying. Her framework was helping people understand kind of these emotional responses to loss. And so how those, created significant change. And often when those are experienced, they're not a linear process. When each individual experiences those things, they can be every person uniquely experiences how they flow through their grief process. But she primarily studied this concept in the concept of people kind of facing terminal illnesses and those types of things. But one thing I think, a quote that she has said that I think is very important in terms of grief was she said, grief must be witnessed to be healed.
I think that in itself is challenging because oftentimes grief is something people want to avoid and kind of run away from. And yeah, I would define grief for me, just what I've experienced, how I've seen it, is just a sense of loss. Um, and not even just a big loss, right? Because we think of sometimes the big losses of death or some kind of big trauma, but even the loss of simple things of, and I could say honestly for me, I've been in a grieving season, I would say that I'm conscious of for the last 4 years. I'm grieving what my life experience was. And I
Yeah.
think those are sometimes things I don't think a lot of people think about or
Yes.
factor in. They're always thinking about the big experiences. So let's go back to how you just kind of how she articulated that and defined that, because now let's even break it down to the smaller levels of losses that people don't often think about, and how they may need to experience that. Just go ahead and talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, and I'll say one thing that I was considering. I mean, obviously with technology and everything going on in the world that we live in today, there's this accelerated rate of change. And
Hmm.
so
Yeah,
in that accelerated rate of change, right? Like we're experiencing loss to some degree in a sense, at an acceleration than what that
true.
we normally have. And so I think even when I started thinking about that, I mean, like you mentioned, if people experience a job relocation or promotion. I was listening to a statistic recently, and it had to do with actually grief, but they were saying that one out of every five people um, like experience a transition in terms of their job,
Mm.
like every year. They're they're experiencing a move or a promotional type change regularly, yearly, and so they're being affected by that. And even when I consider, in terms of the church, right, like pastoral calls or ways the church kind of fills in areas of need in terms of how people move, like there's a lot of moving that goes on and transition that goes on that is really a loss of comfortable and familiar relationships, just ways of life, and you have to grieve those and move into these new places of experience and relationships.
If someone experiences that and that happens to them, how do they even, like, if they're not aware, how do they even become aware? Would you say that they're even grieving that? The change has happened, right? But they may not even be fully aware that they're grieving. How would you say maybe some ways of people like recognizing that or even becoming aware of that where they're not?
Yeah, and I'm trying to think there's five top stressors that we experience as humans, and it's obviously there's death, there's moving. There's, what are the other three? I can't think of them, but
Yeah.
I'll have to look this up and look. But when, even just taking that as an example, like when we know that there is change, right? Maybe that's as simple as we can bring it, is when there's a change in relationship,
Mm.
or change in like your surroundings, right? I think those are very simple ways of identifying that there is going to be losses
Yeah.
involved. And I think that's when we have to practically, whether it's through journaling or just being intentional about looking at really what took place in that transition, or that change, and whether again it's relational or
Yeah.
whether it's based on your surroundings. I think more often than not, you'll see things that kind of rise up that you weren't expecting in a
Mm.
way. So I think it's good to start just paying attention to stuff and maybe journaling or doing on your own. But I also think it's important to be in a relationship with people and having them ask us good questions, right?
Sure.
Or
Yeah. Yeah.
say,
Yeah.
hey, I'm in this transition with a relationship right now. Like, would you be willing to just sit and talk through this so that you can be another set of eyes and ears, and the things that I'm not seeing and hearing, that you can help me participate in making sure that I transition well in
Mm.
that.
No, that's good. And I'm just thinking for me, like, life is busy and I find myself typically going from task to task, right? Or just like, oh, I got to get this thing done, and not slowing down enough to even recognize the grief that may be building up in my system or that I'm experiencing from all that change. Journaling has been really helpful for me, and we have to be honest. Like, I think that's the biggest thing, is like we have to learn to be honest in these spaces, um of like, what am I experiencing, and like maybe itemizing the loss of like, what am I losing, like what has this change, like what's the loss in the change, right? Like,
Mhm.
okay, what routine did it break for me that I'm used to? What expectations are no longer going to be met because of this change? What sense of safety or comfort am I losing with this change? And all those things of taking the time to process. And in our culture, with technology, with fast-paced life that most of us live, um, we don't usually have the space to even recognize that or even begin to pick up those things, unfortunately. Um, and I think that's one of the things that God in this season is probably drawing us back to, and really calling us to embrace these things, um, and to really go on a journey of self awareness,
Yes.
and going to journeys of where's God meeting us, where's actually God calling us. Um, and if you spend any time on social media, in Christian social media, right, and you're scrolling through, it's all like, God's gonna bless you, revival's coming, like all this amazing things. And yes, I agree, God's heart for us is to bless us, and he wants to bring renewal and all those things. um but I think sometimes those things cause us to not focus on ourselves and put our attention on this external thing we're expecting God to do out there, and thinking that external thing is going to fix maybe any feelings of discomfort that I have, or that I don't want to, the areas I don't want to grieve. And like, if revival comes, revival is going to fix everything, and I don't have to deal with my grief, right? Or something like that. And so I think it's the hard place, because I think this is what God is calling us to. It's not comfortable. It's not where any of us really want to go, but truth is, it is the best thing for us.
I think you make a good point in terms of, the busyness, and again goes back to this acceleration that we're all experiencing, whether we want to admit it or are aware of it or not. But Elizabeth Kubler-Ross makes the statement of grief must be witnessed to be healed. Like, when I look at that statement, what jumped out at me was the witness, right? And
Yeah.
so I think we, as humans that have been given a brain to think critically about what we're doing. Like we have to start even thinking about our language and how we perceive the world, how we are then articulating back to people. And so when I look at the witness aspect, I'm like, well, to most people, just a straightforward definition of witness is that you are attesting to an event that took place, that there is something that happened, that you were there. But when I started considering the word witness, like it went a little bit deeper for me because coming from a background where I experienced, trauma and grief at a very young age, my sensory system is very involved and I've been processing it my whole life. So I am very aware of my senses in the aspect of a witness. So when I think of if I'm a part of something that has happened, we are all taking in the information through our what we smell in the room, right? We take in all the sounds that are going on. We take in just the emotions and the feelings and the things. So it's very complex in terms of how we then begin, I think, to process grief, which is why no one processes it the same. But it's very much proven that then later on, right, which you and I have talked about this many times, we get these trigger moments because there may be a sound that's happening that we aren't like consciously aware that it's something that happened in our past that bothers us. But we're in the middle of a conversation with somebody else and all of a sudden we feel something, right? We're frustrated or whatever. So the sound and the smell and all of that very much are these unconscious ways that trigger us. And so I think in terms of when we think of grief and how we're processing that practically, the emotional responses that are connected in those moments, we have to begin to learn to start processing and feeling and looking into those things. And a lot of times, in especially traumatic or, areas that are painful, we don't have language, right? And so it's more in image, we're taking in images and stuff like that. And so when we journal and we process, my journey very much was I have objects to give, but I don't have words. But what happens is if I will just identify the object of what, oh, this anxiety looks like this was real for me, a five-sided, three-dimensional object that sits on my chest. Oh, wow. So in identifying that, I put that on paper and it begins to flesh out. Like I begin to actually have a language. I'm like, oh, that's anxiety, entangled with chronic loneliness, whatever it may be. And then the language starts to come. But what is even more fascinating about that is that when I was doing trauma work with my dad, and we co-facilitated trauma groups within state corrections with parole and probation, the programming that we used, they would pick a certain traumatic event and they would go into, it was like a surgery, like you would pick that event and we would take them back to that event. And we would do it in a safe environment, but the goal is to let them be there and they don't have to talk about it. Like we are not trying to get them to talk about it. Everything is done on paper where they're drawing things on paper. You don't have to be an artist, but the idea is to first and foremost get that energy, that's the emotions around that event out of your body onto the paper. So it doesn't have to be people. It could be scribbles. It could be colors. It could be black pen. It doesn't matter how it's being removed, but just the idea of getting it out of your body in some practical way discharges the emotion around the event. And so then what we do after that is we begin to ask questions about what's happening. And so it starts giving people insights that they've never gotten before. And so I think that example is really how we should approach loss and these areas of grief of like, okay, again, something happened, we identify the transition and then start looking at how much pain was involved, right? How much grief was involved. And then how do we begin to touch those to where you actually feel it? Because most of us don't feel,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
most of us don't feel for a reason because we have been trained to not feel. And so a lot of times the goal is to start identifying feelings or emotions.
Hey, thanks for watching. I hope that content was encouraging to you. If that was something that was encouraging to you, go ahead and click the like button so I can know that this content is actually making an impact on you. Go ahead and share it with someone that you think this could encourage. And then if you're not already subscribed, go ahead and subscribe to the channel so we can stay connected, continue to have these conversations, and continue to grow together in our journey.